Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life. For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at www.veritas.org. The following material is copyrighted and may not be duplicated, reproduced, or redistributed without prior written consent from the Veritas Forum. Join us as we explore true life.
I'm not going to be like Pontius Pilate and ask you if you know what truth is. But I would like to know what you think fantasy is. What do you think fantasy is? Well, that's part of it. A way of finding truth, yeah. What? No, I think it's more a way of going through that into truth. That truth, the truth that we seek, is always beyond ordinary facts. And we tend, in our educational system, to be taught the facts, and I certainly was. And the facts are important, but they're not enough. They don't take you as far as you need to go. And one of the great mistakes that many, many people make is to confuse fact with truth. Facts are facts, and they're necessary. But truth is beyond, out on the other side of facts. And when we want things to be only factual, we really get into trouble. At Berea College in Kentucky, a young woman asked me, what do you think about creationism versus evolution? And I said, well, I really can't get very excited. You know, there's only one question worth asking, and that is, did God make it? And if the answer is yes, why get so excited about how? That's peripheral. You know? The central thing is this incredible universe, which may be one of many universes, planned, organized by a benign creator? Or are we just some kind of a cosmic accident? By and large, the physicists feel that there are so many extraordinary coincidences in the makeup of the universe, from the Big Bang to solar systems capable of sustaining life, that it has to be part of a plan. Now, there is a story that after the Big Bang, the voice of God was heard saying, whoops. And I kind of like that, you know? Here is God with this enormous thing booming out into space, making sound because there was no sound before there was space. And what is God going to do with it? Well, the great creator has ideas. And part of fantasy is moving beyond that which is limited to that which is unlimited and helps us to grow and develop and be. In most of my pre-college schools, we were completely stuck on fact. And sometimes we were stuck on fact to the point of absurdity. I went to an English boarding school for a while, and one of the teachers asked us what our father's middle names were. Well, my father's middle name was Wadsworth, which is a good Philadelphia name. Emily Dickinson's great friend was a Reverend Wadsworth. So I said, my father's middle name was Wadsworth. And she said, no, no, dear, no, Wordsworth. I said, no, my father's middle name is Wadsworth. No, dear, no, Wordsworth. I couldn't win. I mean, there are times you know when to give up with a teacher. As a small child, I grew up in New York City as an only child, and I was not allowed to go out and play with the kids on the street because that simply wasn't done. And I began to understand fantasy. Now, I read and read and read. One of my favorite writers was George MacDonald. And if you want a wonderful description of the Holy Spirit, read at the back of The North Wind, because the North Wind is the Holy Spirit. But I began to understand that the world I was getting in school and the world I moved into when I came home were far removed from each other. The world of school was simply a world of fact. And the world I came home to was a world that transcended fact. One of my favorite books was a lavishly illustrated book of Bible stories, which I loved dearly. But what I loved most about it was that it transcended fact. Try and put the incarnation into a fact. Can you do it? You can't. It doesn't work. It's absurd. Actually, the whole idea of the incarnation is hilarious. That God should so love us. We are weird, but God should so love this weird part of this whoopsie creation that God self would come and be part of us to show us what it's like to be human, what being human is meant to be. And it's not meant to be restricted. It's meant to be open so that we grow and develop. In one of his books, Lauren Isley writes that at a certain point, the human brain pan grew far faster than any evolution would account for in order to make way for a brain as complex as our brains. He gives no explanation of that. I like things that do not have explanations. But we suddenly had this great brain pan, and our brains could evolve and think forward as well as just remember backwards. Now, thinking forwards involves believing in things that are impossible. I think, like the White Queen in Alice in Wonderland, we should believe 7 impossible things every morning before breakfast. Now, it's a very good practice. Everything that I believe is impossible. I can't put God the Creator into any kind of possibility that can be proven with a QED. It's a matter of faith. And faith is for the things that cannot be proved. If we can prove it, why do we need faith? The English theologian H.A. Williams said that faith is the acceptance of doubt rather than, as most people believe, the repression of it. Doubt has led us into faith, whereas refusing to doubt tends to make the faith restrictive and judgmental, and what we believe is better than what anybody else believes, and they're wrong and we're right, and we begin to make comparisons. And I keep going back to Jesus saying, don't judge. As you judge, so shall you be judged. Now, I tend by nature to be very judgmental. This is something I've had to work on hard all my life, not to make dogmatic judgments, but to keep open. One time I was speaking at a university bookstore, and at the end of the day, a young man said to me, I really like what you've been saying, but I haven't read any of your books because I hear they're very religious. Well, all my little red flags of warning unfurled and began blowing wildly in the wind. I said, what do you mean by religious? Khomeini was alive then. Khomeini's religious. Jerry Falwell is religious. What do you mean by religious? And then I heard myself saying, my religion is subject to change without notice. And that is true. If it is not, it is dead. If I am not open to God's revelation, which may shake me to the core, my religion is dead. We certainly, as we look at what we have believed over the centuries, starting going back to Abraham and Sarah, we have changed enormously in our concept of God from an anthropomorphic, bigger-than-life human being to the God who created the stars in their courses, all the wonders, who created each one of us with a capacity to be creative or destructive. If when I was your age, I had looked at any evening news, I would not have believed it. But we do have the capacity to change. And that is often urged on and helped by fantasy. Now, fairy tales are largely folk tales rather than fantasy. Fantasy is trying to move to that truth, which is beyond truth. George MacDonald was my favorite, but I read also H.G. Wells, and I read twice his fabulous book, The War of the Worlds, which is the descent of the Martians, bent on destroying us. And my sophomore year in college, Orson Welles every Sunday night was doing an hour-and-a-half play. So we sat down in front of the room of one of the girls who had a radio to listen to The War of the Worlds. And it was fantastic. I mean, it was wonderful. And I kept saying, you know, if people didn't know this was a book, they might take it seriously. And they did. And that was exciting. But it isn't really fantasy, because fantasy is going beyond easy possibilities to the possibilities which are much harder, which open us and push us. C.S. Lewis wrote his fantasies, and my favorite is Perelandra, because his books of theology did not say enough about God. Theology does not say enough about God. It tries. The German theologians try. They try very hard. I don't much like German theologians. They're very useful for one thing, insomnia. You know? Those long Germanic sentences will put you to sleep, but they're also trying to prove. They're trying to prove things that can't be proven, and fantasy never makes that mistake. Fantasy goes beyond proof into possibility, and the possibility should be, it is not always is, but it should be always hopeful, that we can do better. We can stop making the same mistakes over and over again. We can love. It's a strange thing that after the crucifixion and the resurrection, I try to put those in the language of proof, nothing much changed. And yet everything changed. And that is, again, the world of fantasy. Now, it may sound offensive to say that the incarnation is a fantasy, but fantasy is true. It is that which cannot be proved, but which leads you to a larger truth, one that you couldn't get to otherwise. It's without fantasy, I suspect we might never have stood up on 2 feet, but would be still 4-legged creatures. But somebody reached down and picked up something and looked at it and dreamed about it, and we became the person who makes tools and then the person who tells stories. I think that was probably the first thing. We can do almost everything without language. We can make love, we can say, I'm hungry, Well, we can build houses, but we can't ask questions, and we can't really worship without words. One word will do, alleluia is enough. But we need language. We think because we have words, not the other way around. And once we have words, we begin to understand that in fantasy is where we get a greater idea of what the human spirit is like. Now, Scripture is full of fantasy. One of my favorite bits is Ezekiel's incredible wheels. I mean, they are totally outside the language of ordinary proof. There are all kinds of things that are outside proof. And what we have to do is to look and say, is this real fantasy? Because fantasy leads to truth. Or is this phony fantasy? A lot of phony fantasy is published. It doesn't lead anywhere much. But real fantasy pushes us, opens us, makes us more aware of who we are, who the other is, and that the other may be different. We've always been frightened by differences. And fantasy, again, awakens us to the possibility of differences being positive. We're brought up to fear those who are different. And certainly we live on a planet of very varied and different people, of different languages and different colors and different face shapes. And yet we are all one. We are all part of that one creation. And perhaps only as we learn to look at fantasy do we understand that all of this is real. Now, story takes me further than almost anything else. Little tiny stories. There's a story of the little girl whose parents were having another baby. and they read all the right books about sibling rivalry. They were not going to have their little girl upset. So they had the baby, and they brought her home, and the little girl was allowed to hold the baby, help change the baby, and everything was fine until time to put her to bed, and she got upset. And she said, "I want to see baby." I said, "Well, of course, darling, we'll go see the baby." "No, I want to see baby alone." "Well, Mommy and Daddy will go with you." "No, I want to see baby alone." And she got almost hysterical. So they finally let her go into the baby's room. And she bent over the crib and she said, "Tell me about God. I'm forgetting." I think we forget. I think when we rule out the world of fantasy, I mean, as kids we're told, oh, fantasy is all right for you as kids. I mean, outgrow it. Get back into the real world of fact, of provable fact. It's not a very real world. It certainly has not got much to do with truth. And it has nothing to do with that fantasy which enlarges us, which takes us further. Stories are sometimes serious. They're sometimes hilarious. And we do well not to forget the hilarious ones, because laughter is part of what makes us human, the ability to laugh at ourselves and each other without being derogatory. There is a story, there are many stories about St. Peter at the pearly gates. And that's one I'm particularly fond of, when Peter goes to Jesus and says, "Jesus, I'm really burned out. I mean, I have been here for hundreds and hundreds of years, and I'm just burned out, and I need a day off. Would you mind taking the gates just for one day?" And Jesus said, "Well, sure, Peter, I'll be glad to do that." So Peter goes to lie down, and Jesus goes to the gates, and the first person to come knocking is a little old man, all gnarled and ancient, and not sure he should really be there knocking at the pearly gates. And he says, I'm a little old man, and all my life I've been a carpenter, and I had a son, and he died." And Jesus said, "Father?" And the little old man said, "Pinocchio!" Sometimes we need to be knocked. Yeah. A story needs to knock us back. It usually comes at a time when we've been a little too sure, a little too fast with the answers that really are not answers at all. We forget what one of my favorite theologians called the mystery of the Word made flesh. It is a mystery. It cannot be explained. When I go to communion, I'm taking the entire universe into my body, and it cannot be explained. It is mystery, it is fantasy, it is that which is beyond ordinary speech, ordinary thinking. Our dreams sometimes help us understand this. I sometimes get little instructions in dreams. I'm going next week to the prairie up the mountain, Mount Calvary. And I was there a few years ago, and Brother William said, "Madeleine, I have a story for you." And so I beamed in expectation. And William said, there was this preacher who was preaching hellfire and damnation and weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth. And this little woman said, "Oh, how many teeth?" And the preacher, "Teeth will be provided." So that night at Vespers, the last reading was one of Matthew's Hell and Damnation readings. And I went to bed and I went to sleep and I dreamed. I dreamed that Jesus said, no, you don't burn the sins away. You wash them away with pure, clear water. And if they're ingrained very deeply, you use warm, soapy water. But you wash them away and you must be very, very gentle. Now that may be in the language of fantasy, but it is also true. We need to be gentle with each other. We need to have people be gentle with us, because often, beyond brutality, the only thing that works is gentleness. Another dream I had that's very important to me was I was at conference center in Louisiana to give a retreat. And it was a huge Catholic conference center with a school, a seminary, a church, and the conference center. And there were people going in and out of the church. And I was told that it was a funeral for a high school girl whose car had somehow unaccountably wrapped itself around a tree as she was coming home. That was heavy. But the conference began, and we had rice and red beans and chopped onions, so I knew I was in the South. And I went to bed and to sleep. And I dreamed that I was outside the conference center with far many more people than were there. And here were these great live oak trees dripping with Spanish moss. And the stars were far more beautifully patterned. There were far more of them than we normally see. And then in the east, there was a child of light, and the stars began dancing around the child. And I realized when I woke up that I had been given a resurrection dream for that girl. And that has stayed with me all these years since as being not a fantasy in the sense that we tend to use fantasy, but a fantasy in the real sense, that resurrection is real, that it isn't made up, that it's a promise that is true. Back shortly after the Russian Revolution, all the people of Moscow were called into Red Square. And for an hour, one of their new atheist leaders harangued them on the non-existence of God. He proved conclusively that there is no God. And among the people was a Russian priest, and he asked if he could say 3 words, and he was given permission. And he stood up and he said, "Christ is risen." And the entire mob yelled out, "He is risen indeed." You know? You can't kill it. You can't prove it, but you can't kill it. And that which is true fantasy cannot be killed. It cannot be proved, but it cannot be killed. And it is what makes us human creatures, able to say, "I'm sorry, I was wrong, I didn't understand, please forgive me, please tell me you still love me." And that may be the most important one of all. Because in the world of fantasy, love is primary. Love, no matter what we do or how little we deserve it, God help us all if we had to deserve it. But it is the primary, fundamental foundation of a world where fantasy is possible. Now, I've also had to learn, and the hard way, that God has a sense of humor, and often at my expense. There was one time I was going to Madeleine College in Chicago, which is Catholic, to Wheaton College in Illinois, which is evangelical, and to the Episcopal Diocese of Idaho, which is Episcopalian. I mean, a nice ecumenical trip. And as I was being driven between Madeleine and Wheaton, I could feel myself coming down with a heavy laryngeal cold. It was a lot worse than the allergies I've got today. I mean, it was a real bad laryngeal cold. And I said, "Dear God, please, please, I've got 11 more talks to give. Please don't let me lose my voice." Within 24 hours, I had the worst attack of intestinal flu I have ever had. And my voice was fine. And I said, "I am not amused." It, to a certain extent, changed the way I pray. I'm a little more careful. I mean, give God a chance, he'll give us a poke. And that's wonderful, because that means God is present. God is part of the real fantasy that informs the Gospels, that allows us to believe that God did come, that we're so loved. Not hated, but so loved. I've bumped into a lot of people who think that God is a God of punishment, primarily. You know, do you don't watch out, God will get you. You have to be good, otherwise God will get you. Well, we're not good. I mean, I knew one good person. She was absolutely dreadful. We're far too complicated to be good. But the one thing that saves us is we know that we are loved. No matter what we do, we are still loved. We are God's beloved children by adoption and grace. And nothing can take that away. In some colleges I have been to, God does look like Moses, and Moses in a bad temper at that. That is not my vision of God. If I had to have an anthropomorphic vision of God, it would be very feminine. It would be George MacDonald, who had a long beard. And I see myself sitting in his lap and stroking his beard and having him put his arms around me and saying, there, dear, it's all right. And that's a feminine image, even if it's of George MacDonald. But it's of that love that affirms, yes, this is quite terrible, but I'm with you. I'm part of what you're going through. That's what the incarnation is all about. I am part of it. And even in Hebrew scripture, God is always in there, poking his nose in, seeing what's going on, being chastised by Abraham, who said, should not the maker of the universe do what is right? All through scripture, we have a very active dialogue with God. One of the most glorious lines, which may seem to be fantasy, is from Job, where Job, all those thousands of years before Christ, says, I know that my Redeemer liveth, and that I shall see him face to face. And we know that. And we also know that at this point we cannot see God face to face, or we will die. Moses wanted to, and God put him in the cleft of a rock and protected him with his hand, and all Moses saw was God's backside as he passed by. God's hindquarters, that's all Moses got. I think that's wonderful. It puts us in our place. We are not gods. We may be a little lower than the angels, but we are not gods. We're creatures whose call it is to serve, to listen, to worship, to adore, to forgive ourselves first and then others, to dare try things we really shouldn't dare try, but nothing would happen if we didn't. And something that fascinates me is that most of the great scientific discoveries have been made when the scientist was not thinking. There's a story of one scientist who sat in his study in his white robe and thought and thought and thought, and nothing came, and he finally said, put his hat and coat on, this was in Vienna, went and got on the trolley cars. He stepped on the trolley car, it came. He had stopped thinking, and it came. The discovery of, which one is it that looks like a snake swallowing its own tail? Yeah. He dreamed that the snake was swallowing its tail, and then it came when he was not thinking. When I conducted Writer's Workshop, the last thing I say is, when you write, don't think. Write. Because if you think, you're in control. You're in charge. You'll get in the way. Now, I'm not putting down thinking. I had a very good education. I'm very grateful for it. But there comes a point when you have gone as far as thinking will take you, and then you move into the world that might be called fantasy, which is that world beyond where your mind will take you. And then you stop. You stop short, and you listen. And you may hear some extraordinary things. But they will be exciting. They may push you in places you don't want to go. And they may lead you temporarily to anxiety and even despair. When I wrote A Wrinkle in Time, we were living in Northwest Connecticut, and I was asking all the big cosmic questions that we tend to ask as adolescents, but I was married and had 3 children. I was still asking them and finding no answers, and reading theologians and finding no answers. They're not all as bad as the German theologians, but they still are dealing with things in terms of fact which should only be dealt with in terms of fantasy. And I picked up a book which quoted Einstein as saying, anyone who's not lost in rapturous awe at the power and glory of the mind behind the universe is as good as a burnt-out candle. And I thought, I have found my theologian. And then I began to read particle physics and quantum mechanics, which I still read for theology, because they're dealing with the nature of being. When we discovered the world of particle physics, everything changes. Everything changes with every major scientific discovery. I've never seen any conflict between science and religion, because all science can do is enlarge our vision of God. I mean, it really threw the church into a terrible tizzy when they had to accept that we are not a planet that is the center of the universe, with everything revolving around us. We are, in fact, only a minor planet in an ordinary solar system on the outskirts of an ordinary spiral galaxy. I mean, that's a big displacement. And yet we somehow managed to accept that. Well, what we're asked to do now is just as enormous, because the world of the very, very small is quite different from the world of the incredibly large, and far more intimate. In the world of the very, very small, nothing happens in isolation. Everything affects everything else. You can never say it's my own business. It's the business of the entire cosmos. The scientists have discovered that nothing can be studied objectively, because to look at something is to change it and be changed by it. I mean, we'll all be changed because of the weather and of the destruction of trees. I think we're being told something about the destruction of trees. In northwest Connecticut, where I have a cottage, there was the last stand of virgin pine left. I mean, these great 200- and 300-year-old trees. We're not tornado country. 3 tornadoes came and met and wiped it out. There was very little house damage. It was all tree damage. The only building that got damaged was the Methodist church. And it vanished. It simply vanished. There was nothing left. Not a piece of wood, not a piece of glass, not a nail, nothing. It was as though it had never been there. I thought there must be a message in that somewhere. But it was the loss of those trees. I will still sometimes drive by where they were, and you can't see that they were ever there. I think the planet is trying to tell us something, because all of creation is far more sentient than we realize. God didn't make dead things. God made living things. Have you ever gone out and put your ear to a tree and listened to its song? And each tree sings a little bit differently, and you can hear it. And those magnificent trees, which had seen 300 years of history in New England, were gone, just as though they had never been there. We are supposed to be able to listen, to care. In the world of fantasy, there's a great deal of caring. We don't take things coldly, and nor are we told to keep a stiff upper lip. I went to this English boarding school where I was not allowed to have my father's name be Wadsworth. We were taught to have a stiff upper lip, never to show emotion. This was an Anglican school. Never to show emotion, never to cry, never to grieve, never to ask for help. As far as I'm concerned, we were asked to be dead. We had mandatory morning and evening prayer, read badly by one of the mistresses, and somehow the great language of Cranmore and Coverdale seeped through the cracks. And we were nourished even without knowing it, because language is nourishing, and the English language, which is very complex and unruly, is thereby even more nourishing. Wonderful, wonderful words. One of my favorite ancient prayers is from about the 3rd century. It's a nighttime prayer. It's, guide us waking, O Lord, and guard us sleeping, that awake we may watch with Christ, and asleep we may rest in peace. And that's from the office of Compline, which is the go to bed quietly and fearlessly office. Not said in chapel, not said on the knees or standing, but the monk just said it wherever they were sitting. And with this beautiful intimacy with God, where they could hear Jesus saying, fear not, little flock. I'm with you. I came because I care. I came because I love you. There are people who can't believe this, and the idea of the incarnation is just too fantastic. Well, it is fantastic. It is high fantasy, which is high truth. And we do well to remember that, not to push it down and say, oh, this is childish. It isn't. It's being the most grown up we can possibly be. It's what gets us through the horrendous vicissitudes of life, through death, through other kinds of losses, and yet affirms that we are still beloved, and that we understand this love largely as we dare to move through the world of fact into the world of fantasy, which affirms us, affirms that we are loved and that we are capable of loving in return. If we base our emotions on TV, particularly the commercials, we get wiped out. The TV commercials try to get us to believe that life is normal. And life is not normal. Life is like the weather we've just had. But we're fooled into thinking that life should be normal. If it's not normal, then our feelings are hurt. And we're upset at the weather, and we're upset at God, and we think this is all abnormal. This is the way it is. There's the Psalms that talk about God's riding on the cherubim, on the flames of wind. It's a wild and wonderful universe. The sun is an atomic furnace, bursting with explosions all of the time. It's at this point a middle-aged sun. It will run down ultimately. Not in our lifetimes, not even in yours, but it will burn itself out. We don't understand black holes. I don't think even Stephen Hawking really understands black holes. But maybe if we get through one, we would come out into another universe, something quite different, and yet it would still be God's universe. The extraordinary and wonderful thing is that God has been most with me when things have been worse. When things go well, I thank God, but it's when things are really bad that I'm aware of God's presence and the wonder of the incarnation. When I go to bed at night, I read the office of Compline, that last office of the day, and I ask myself two questions, and I'll tell you what they are. One came from a conference in Texas when a first grade teacher told us about a little Mexican boy who looked like a little old man. He had calloused hands, and he wore little old man's clothes, and he didn't know anything. But he was quick, he was eager, he wanted to learn. He was wonderful. And she thought he was terrific, and she began teaching the kids behavior she thought was appropriate and behavior she thought was inappropriate. And he was fascinated. So one day she said, "Now, Carlo, what have I been teaching you?" They said, "We is not supposed to behave with behavior which is inappropriate." I said, "That's right, Carlo. Why is it that we're not supposed to?" Said, "We is not supposed to behave with behavior which is inappropriate because it had pissed Jesus off." And I told that to my friend David Somerville, the Archbishop of Vancouver, who said, "What a wonderful way to examine the conscience." And it is. So that's one of the questions I ask. Then I dropped down 3 centuries to Thomas Traherne. And Thomas Traherne said, we are supposed to give pleasure to God. And I asked myself, did I do anything today that would give pleasure to God? And that is sometimes harder to answer than the other one. But there's almost always something. Maybe it was just that I managed to cook dinner for 50 people, which quite often happens. But there's always a little something that where you weren't in the way, which means, therefore, that you're open to the world of fantasy, and you were able to give pleasure to God. And that's what we're called on to do. It's a wonderful calling. I think growing up with the world of fantasy as a real world, as my parents allowed it to be, was an enormous help to me. My father was a music and drama critic. My parents were out at night, and there was nobody to take me to Sunday school on Sunday mornings, and I feel very blessed. And I missed all of that garbage that so many people have to spend their lives unlearning. I was always given a God of love and a God to whom I was supposed to give pleasure. That's what college is for. It's good for the things of the mind. We do need to use our mind as far as we can use them. But then out on the other side of the mind is the world of fantasy, the world of reality, and the world of love. Now, it's almost 3 o'clock, so it's time for questions. The second question? Oh, the first one is, what did I do to piss Jesus off? And the other one is, what did I do to please God? That's the more important of the two questions, because it's harder to answer. I mean, I'm always doing things I shouldn't do. If somebody could come up and sort of check the hands, this light is difficult. And I hope there'll be some hands to check. Thanks, Christy.
I can't fix the light, but we have microphones down here, so if you have a question, you can just come and line up and ask, and then everyone can hear it well, and she'll know that someone's asking a question.
It'd be nice to know that somebody's asking a question.
You just open your mouth and start talking. Right?
Oh, no. It's much harder to give a talk without a prepared pieces of paper. I've been writing this talk for a week. Yeah.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
First of all, I need to tell you, I have a 21-year-old daughter, and since the age of 7, when she read A Wrinkle in Time and A Swiftly Tilting Planet and A Wind in the Door, she's been reading you ever since. And her goal is to read all of your writings. So I want to publicly thank you for what you have offered to at least one child in the world, and I know there are many, many others who have read you widely, but my daughter is a wonderful child, and I really am glad that she had you as a guide. So I need to say that to you first.
Thank you.
Yes. And then I have, you addressed this a little bit, but I have a term that goes through my mind called the dream of the world. And I wonder if you could comment on the fantasy of the world also dreaming us. If there is something about that that you might be able to talk to me or to us about in terms of fantasy.
I think almost everybody has a dream. It's a little easier to express the dream for those of us who believe in God. Because if you live in an accidental world, the dream gets diffused. I find that there is a great longing for God in many people who have grown up without God today. A longing for understanding that we are important, that we matter, that what we do matters. And without knowing that, we can't dream. We can't have this fantasy for the world that we want and for ourselves and for the whole cosmos.
Thank you. Also, I'd like to invite you to my home state, which is Maine. I'm here visiting, and I happened to find out that you were speaking today, so I needed to be here to hear you. But I run a center in Maine, and I would love to have you come as a guest speaker, so I might try to catch you afterwards.
That's great. Get me through. You just write to the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York.
Oh,
And I will
okay.
get your letter.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Hi. I also want to thank you for having written A Wrinkle in Time. I loved it so much when I was a child, and I just bought it again to reread it as an adult. I was intrigued by the title of your talk about going beyond fact to a greater truth through fantasy. I guess one of the reasons why I have never believed in God is because to me it always seemed like such a, as you said, an easy fantasy. And I am so much in awe of the universe that any idea of God that I've ever heard of seemed like such a limited, easy fantasy compared with just the wonder that we find when we explore and think about the universe. I guess I understand everything that you've said at a certain level, except all of this use of God, and I guess I just don't.
I hope I never said it was an easy fantasy. It's the hardest one in the world.
I see.
There's one theologian whose name I forget, who said, God must be very great indeed to have put us in a universe where there's so many things to negate the whole idea, so many things against him. The idea of God is not easy at all. I mean, I have to hang on till my nails are bloody to keep believing in God. It's no easy fantasy. But it is, it's kind of like the man who was on a cliff and he fell off and he was caught by a little tiny bush, just a wee little bush, which wasn't going to hold. And he yelled, "Is anybody up there?" And this voice said, "Yes." He said, "What shall I do?" The voice said, "Let go." He said, "Is anybody else up there?" If I believe in God wholly and completely for 2 minutes every 7 or 8 weeks, I'm doing well. This is not something that is easy or that we can hold on to every day and say yes. It is life-threateningly difficult, but it matters.
In your fantasies, like Wrinkle in Time, you have embedded eternal truths in that fantasy, very much like C.S. Lewis does. Yesterday you told us that your characters must be themselves and they take on their own lives. Did you plan beforehand that your characters would do this, or did they decide to put these eternal truths in the
Oh, the
fantasy?
character decided, I didn't. And I think probably most of you know that A Wrinkle in Time almost never got published. I would occasionally get a question saying, who is this book for? Is this book for children? Is this book for adults? Who is it for? And I say, well, it's for people. Don't people read books? Okay. And I had actually called it back. It had gone the rounds of all of the publishers. And I called my agent and I said, send it back. Nobody's going to buy it. It's not going to work. And he sent it back, and that should have been the end of it. And my mother was with us for Christmas, and I gave her a party with some of her old New York friends. And one of them belonged to a small writers group that John Farrar Strasheru ran. And she wanted me to meet him. Well, I was not particularly interested at that point. But they had turned the book down with an odd proviso. If nobody else wants it, let us have it again. So, this being in the days before photocopies, I took my battered manuscript, took the subway downtown, and went to John's office. And he had read my first novel, The Small Rain, and he had liked it. And he read Wrinkle, and he loved it, but he was scared of it. And when a publisher is scared of a book, they go to a librarian for assessment. And this librarian's assessment was short. It was, I think this is the worst book I have ever read. It reminds me of The Wizard of Oz. So they decided they would publish it. And they took me out for lunch and said, now, dear, this book is not going to sell. Of course, it can't be read below high school, that typical underestimation of kids. We'd just like to have you on our list in case you do something better next time. So when it took off like a skyrocket, they were totally astounded. And that's how things happen. And I'm very glad it was published, and by Farrar Strasheru, because they have allowed me to write what I want. When I wrote A Wind in the Door, it was 10 books and 10 years later. They haven't pushed, Roger Strauss once said at a little lunch party, and Madeleine, you'll have to admit, we've never once asked you to write Son of Wrinkle. Now, a world of not very nice fantasy is the world of Hollywood. And I finally had a contract that I was willing to sign, because I have to have that clause giving the producer freedom to change character and theme reversed. Well, that was reversed. But they had a clause in it giving them the rights to the movie in perpetuity throughout the universe. So I took a red pen and I made an asterisk. And I said, with the exception of Sagittarius and the Andromeda Galaxy. Well, they had a serious meeting of the lawyers. In case I knew something they didn't know. We're still futzing over a movie. Miramax has it now. We'll see.
I just wanted, when you talk about, obviously, that love and the love of God is the main, like mercy, and how I do think that a lot of people do. I see a lot of people shy away from Christianity, from God, because they don't want to have that childhood that they had guilt or like sin. God's gonna like hit me or something. But I just wondering how you reconcile. Because while I believe that, I think that's the most fruitful way for us to come to God is to just realize that we want to do good for Him. That's the best thing. We want to love Him and please Him. But all the hard sayings in the scriptures, like when Christ's like, you're going to come knocking and say, Lord, Lord, and I'm going to say, I didn't know you.
I'm sorry, how I reconcile what with what?
How the hard sayings in the gospel that seem like there is a side of God that is sort of, and so I was just wondering what your thoughts were on those ones where He says, you know what, there's going to be a line, and I'm going to say, look, I didn't know you, you didn't know me, or something, and how we.
I don't.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't reconcile it. I tried it by saying, well, that was written years after Jesus died. We don't know exactly what He said. Is this consistent with His entire personality as it comes through the four Gospels? I don't know. I think there's only one purpose for punishment, and that is to teach a lesson. And there's only one lesson to be taught, and that is love. Otherwise, it's not punishment. It's retribution or revenge. And I don't think Jesus went in for retribution or revenge. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of stuff I don't reconcile in the Bible. There's a lot of quite dreadful stuff. In Judges, I think, if a woman sees her husband is fighting with another man, she goes to help and touches the other man's balls, her hands get cut off. I mean, and what about that woman who's cut in 12 pieces? And it's a real lot of terrible stuff. But I don't believe in just reading bits of the Bible. I read it all, including the begats. And the begats are great for characters' names. But we don't have to reconcile it all to have it be a great book. Yeah. I don't go for bibliolatry. That's as much of an olatry as any other.
Okay. I kind of had another, when you were bringing up Hollywood, I had another thing I was wondering. Did you see Amistad by any chance?
What?
Amistad? Amistad, it was a movie.
Oh, I haven't seen it.
Oh, okay. Well, they have amazing, right in the middle, like this sort of Christ, like the slaves looking at a picture of the Bible, and it's this beautiful like part. It just made me, and it was the first thing, and I know you said yesterday it's horrible to say, Christian films or Christian music versus, it should just come through. But I was just wondering, and now that I've been thinking about entering that field and putting stuff out there, sort of like maybe your books in the way that it just, brings across truths in a way that people can maybe actually stomach them or like would pay to, and not think that it's going to be some brainwashing. But I was wondering, it's one of those things that seems like you would wake up in the morning, one of your 7 impossible things that the world would actually, because it seems like there's so much bad TV and so much bad movies, and like, just wondering if you had any comments or encouragement for trying to, even though against all the odds of getting some really good stuff out there, and stop complaining about it, but really doing something about it, like what you might have to.
I saw a video of the mission not long ago, and I said, have we ever done anything good in the name of Christ? Sometimes it's a question I wonder about. But yes, we have, and whenever we love, we make ourselves vulnerable. And the more people we love, the more vulnerable we are. And if we're not willing to be vulnerable, nothing is going to work. And if we make ourselves vulnerable, we're going to get hurt. It's as simple as that. There are no easy answers. But also, we may be more alive. And I should see Amistad, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I was wondering if maybe you could talk to us a little bit about the issue of forgiving ourselves. I know you touched on it a little bit speaking to us, but I think it's a struggle with me and with close friends of mine who are trying to follow Christ too, is the issue of God has forgiven me, but how do I reconcile it with, my own spirit?
The thing that helped me most was one time somebody I loved had done something absolutely awful. And I went to my confessor and I said, I have failed her. I have failed her completely. I have failed her, or she couldn't have done that. And he said calmly, who are you to think you're better than our Lord? After all, he was singularly unsuccessful with a great many people. And that helped me to forgive myself. Sometimes not forgiving ourselves is a supreme act of arrogance. And we have to let it go. And it's hard.
I loved your story of the 2-year-old speaking to the baby. I have a 1-year-old now, and I agree with that story because...
You know, would you mind using that mic because I can hear better out of that one?
Can you hear this better?
Yeah, much
Great.
better.
I'm a mom of a 1-year-old now, and I love that story of the baby and the 2-year-old. And recently I was thinking along those lines, and after hearing you speaking, what advice could you give a new mom or parents after knowing what you know now about fantasy to help our children stay close to God? And, you know, I guess that's it. Help us also come back.
A librarian at law school once asked me, what do you think you and Hugh did that was best for your children? I said, we love each other. And I'm sure that was the right answer. As I look back on my children, who are wonderful grown-ups, and my grandchildren are so magnificent I couldn't begin to describe them. But I think some of the things we did with the best will in the world were the worst. Some of the things we did absolutely accidentally were the best. We just fumble along and love each other and love them, and know we'll make mistakes, and that the best thing to do is pick the kid up and hug. There is no real model for parenting that I have found that is any good. We just try the best we can, and the main thing is don't lose your temper in front of the child if you can help it. And if you do lose your temper, apologize. I apologize daily. And let yourself be real. And then read to them at night for hours. And let them pray for hours.
This is a question a little bit left over from yesterday, from the writer's workshop, which I asked you at the end. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the process of acting because of your experience in the theater, and how the creation of a character that you would present to people in a play or in a dramatic situation, how that process is connected or similar to the process of writing.
I'm very glad I did have my time in the theater because I heard words. I didn't just read them. I always advise my writer students to read aloud to themselves or to somebody else if they can, so they can hear it. Because what you hear has a different effect than what you write. And I was always a general understudy, and nobody ever got sick. And the most exciting thing I ever did was play the musical Saw. Now, there's a line in the Cherry Orchard that says, what was that sound I just heard? It sounded like a bucket being dropped in a pit or a harp string being broken. So we dropped buckets. We broke harp strings. Nothing was right, and finally somebody came up with the musical Saw. If you hold the musical Saw just right and you go like that, it goes ooh. And if you hold it not quite just right, it goes clonk. And I was terrified every night that it would go clonk. It actually went clonk in rehearsal, but never in real life. That was the hardest thing I ever did on stage. I had 2 lines in one show. I was playing the matron of a prison in the last act. My 2 lines on Broadway were, but it might be important, sir, but it can't do any harm. I think all of the arts feed each other, that it's important to go see pictures. I had a friend who went to what he thought was going to be a real mishmash of loads and loads of pictures at the Metropolitan Museum, instead of which they were taken to one picture and told to stay there and look at it for 20 minutes, and then to write down what it meant to them. Then they were taken to another picture and told to stay there for 20 minutes and look at it, and then write down what it meant to them, but not use any words they hadn't used in the first piece. And they really were taught to observe. I know far too often in museums I go clonk, clonk, clonk from picture to picture instead of absorbing what it's about. There is one picture in the Clark Museum in Williamsburg, Mass., which is one of the great small museums. They have a wonderful collection of Dutch painters. And it's obvious that the artist did the best he could for this woman who was ugly. You know? Yeah, absolutely the best he could. But in the background, it's a very dark picture. In the background is a little monkey going. So he had his say. Music is important to me, listening to music, because each art nourishes the other. And of course, we have to read.
I think there are a few among us who are Sunday school survivors, and it really brings to mind the question, what can the church do to promote fantasy?
A little persecution would be a help. I mean, we do best when we are persecuted, when we really have to think what we believe and stand up for it. It's too easy. We're getting too tolerant. And I'm totally against intolerance and thinking that this Christian is better than that Christian. But we're allowing almost anything to go. And that isn't true. Jesus makes demands. Whether we're Baptists or Catholics, there are certain demands that are made of us. When we forget them, we lose a lot. Truth, telling our kids to tell the truth as far as they can see it. Not to alibi. My favorite alibi story comes right out of Scripture. And it's when Moses is up on the mountain talking to God. He's up there much too long, and the people get restive, and they want something to worship. So they get Aaron to take all of their earrings and all of their gold beads, and he makes them a golden calf. So they're very happily dancing around it, worshiping it. And Moses comes down, and he is furious with Aaron. And Aaron says, well, I mean, I just took the people's earrings and the gold, and I put them in the furnace, and I quote, out came this calf. We did it then, we do it now. So learn not to alibi, to say, yes, I'm sorry, I blew it, I was wrong, forgive me. Even if I haven't been to Sunday school, I still learned a lot to survive in that English boarding school.
Pardon me. Disregarding the events of the past 2 weeks, are we rapidly approaching the conditions of the time of Noah?
I heard that God wept. I told this yesterday, that God wept and wept and wept for 40 days and 40 nights. And that was the flood. God's grief, not God's tears. I don't think we have to approach the time of Noah. Anyhow, God said fire next time, not flood. I suspect that the American people have had it. I mean, simply the fact that Clinton's popularity has gone up instead of down means we've had it. We've had it with vicious gossip, whether it's true or not. There are things that need to be in what my son used to call privacy. We need to have the media stop slamming it all over our faces. We need to think now, are we for or against capital punishment? And if we are against it, what do we do about it? I'm not ready for the millennium. Besides, it's 4 years off. I mean, the date's wrong by 4 years. And nothing happened at the first, so why should anything happen at the second? We just need to get to it, think about ourselves, and confess. When I go for my dog walk at night, I walk past a Buddhist temple, in front of which is a very larger than life-size statue of Saint Shinran Shonin, who was a Buddhist saint of the 11th century. And this particular statue was in Hiroshima when the bomb fell. And he was sent by the Buddhists of Japan to the Buddhists of New York as a symbol of forgiveness and peace. And I walk by it with my dog and I say, good night, Saint Shinran, forgive us. We have not yet confessed as a country of the many things that we have done wrong. We do alibi. We say, out came this calf. We need to stop doing that.
We have time for one more question, and then we hope that you'll all stay on for a worship service at 4. So.
I just actually I've sort of been thinking about this for a while, about why the heck God created us in the first place, because I feel like we just cause so much havoc, and I just don't, like, so that was one of my main questions, is why would he create us? What was his reason for putting us on this earth? And sort of, like, I believe in the whole, he knows what's going to happen, but we have free will, but that's sort of a weird boundary, and I was just wondering if you had anything to say about that.
My favorite theologian said, "It is in the nature of love to create." As for God's foreknowledge and our free will, the Russian theologian Berdyaev believed that there were things God chose not to know, so as not to interfere with our free will. This is, again, one of those questions that has no answer. I know that God allows us to use our free will. I mean, we're not puppets. We're not Pinocchios. He doesn't come in and wave magic wands and pull strings and get us to do the right thing. He lets us make our own mistakes. And we have made terrible mistakes, but we've also done wonderful things. One summer, my 9-year-old granddaughter was hit by a truck, and she was in the hospital all summer. But we saw kids coming in looking pale and wan, and 2 days later having wheelchair races as their hearts had been fixed. I see because I have contact lenses on. I mean, 50 years ago, I'd be blind. We've done terrible things. We've done wonderful things. We need to look at them and say, okay, which was great and which was not? How are we creative and how are we destructive? And there is hope. There is always hope. I'm not sure whether optimism and pessimism are genetic or not, but my writing slants up. And I'm basically optimistic, and I don't want it otherwise. We do find what we look for. We look for the bad things, we'll find them. If we look for hope and strength and courage, in spite of all the bad things, and laughter, then we'll find those.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at www.veritas.org.